So I'm going to talk about circling approaches,
This meeting
which
is
is,
being recorded.
oh, sorry. I think that was just Zoom talking over me. Okay. I'm going to talk about circling approaches, which is instrument approaches reverting to visual reference, so as to make landing on a different runway. Visual circuits with prescribed tracks, VPT, offset approaches, and low level and bad weather circuits. They're all rather similar and confusable procedures, but they're also very distinct, as I hope I'll describe. So, starting with the circling approach, it's a type of instrument approach procedure that allows an aircraft to approach a runway under IFR, possibly in IMC, but requires a visual maneuver to align with and land on a different runway than the one initially approached. Often necessary when the instrument approach doesn't align with the available runways due to terrain obstacles or airspace restrictions. Although the maneuver is visual, it is still an IFR procedure. And that's something that I know has been discussed online, but it definitely is an IFR procedure. Um, an element of confusion I often hear is that because they're called circling, they entail a 180-degree turn. But that's not the case. A circling approach may only be an adjustment of a few degrees. And there are several examples of executive jets mishandling apparently quite small course changes, but going unstable. It seems that a common cause is a lack of recognition of the dangers just because the turn is small and not considered a challenge. Um, the circling approach takes place where a final approach course doesn't align with the landing runway. The approach is for a runway that's not available or suitable. The could we possibly mute whoever that is, Nathaniel, please? So I've got some voices in
Yeah.
my ear anyway. Yeah. Where the airport layout requires a turn because of terrain obstacles or airspace, or because runway configurations require backtracking or landing from a non-straightened angle. Those are the main reasons that they happen. Um, an offset approach has its own minima, such as this one at Le Bourget, while a circling approach uses circling minima within a protected area. And the aircraft must remain within a defined circling protection area, which is specified here on this chart. But obviously, I'm not going to go through that item by item, but it's on the video, and obviously it will be on the recording of this seminar as well if you want to look at it in detail. Um, Again, are you on the muting, Nathaniel? I've still
Yeah.
got voices in
Yes, I
my
have
ear.
muted a couple of people. I don't even know
Okay,
where that's coming from.
no, okay. Um,
That's
so
all fixed. That's all fixed.
Thank you. A circling approach has a defined circle to land minimum descent altitude, MDA, rather than a decision altitude, meaning the pilot must descend no lower than the circling MDA and then maintain visual conditions to complete the maneuver. The MDA is published in the AIP and jet plates for different speed categories, as you can see here. And if visual contact is lost, a missed approach must be executed. The most important thing is that the pilot must maintain continuous visual contact with the landing runway or airport environment. In conditions of reduced visibility, that means tighter radius turns and lower height um, in order to be both below the cloud and in a position to land. I mean, lower than a normal circuit. And the combination of low height, poor visibility, and more extreme maneuvers inevitably increases the risk of colliding with terrain or obstacles of CFIT. It's imperative that if the visibility drops or the runway is lost from sight, an immediate missed approach must be executed by making a climbing turn towards the landing runway. Uh, Pilots should make left turns unless otherwise specified on the approach plate or authorized by ATC, which confusingly means that the first turn is to the right to establish in the left-hand pattern. We get that confusion at Biggin Hill fairly often. In our kinds of aircraft, we should use rate one turns or only exceed them slightly if you need to turn to fly the turn accurately. And pilots should generally enter the maneuver in landing configuration, gear down, flap set, and maintain it during the circling phase to minimize workload and reduce emissions. In aircraft where maneuvering with landing flap can increase the risk of stall, the pilot should consider whether to land with approach flap. This is very type and runway dependent. Because the protected area is determined by approach speed category, the aircraft should be flown at the appropriate speed as previously detailed, especially in poor visibility. Pilots should bear in mind wind drift when selecting circling tracks and stay within the protected area and in the sight of the runway. Drift away from the runway can result in losing the runway in the murk, and drift towards the runway can result in overshooting the centerline and potentially unstable and unsafe maneuvering on final. This usually means doubling the drift correction outbound to allow for drift in the inbound turn, much the same as in a hold. If that carries a risk of losing the runway, you might consider a diversion to a runway with less crosswind. You shouldn't descend below MDA till you can see the threshold and are in a position to make a normal landing on the intended runway, meaning that you should be turning to final as the descent is initiated. It also requires judgment, and my suggestion is to use constant aspect on a continuous turn onto final approach, whether from the downwind or some intermediate track if you're not doing a full reversal. Continuous aspect, which entails keeping a continuous slope 3 degrees in IFR, is easy once you've grasped it, and you may have been taught to use it for forced landings, albeit at higher approach angles, but it's something worth practicing either on the aircraft or a sim. You can practice in a normal visual circuit by starting a descent adjacent to the threshold and just keeping the visual aspect constant. If visual reference is lost before landing, or it's clear that the landing cannot be executed safely, you must immediately execute a missed approach. Unless the approach plate says otherwise, the missed approach procedure is based on the initial approach runway, not the landing runway. The first action is to make a climbing turn towards the landing runway and overhead the airfield, and then to maneuver onto the missed approach track from the original runway. This can be achieved either circling or in an S-bend. Now, it can be a challenge as you may be pointing in exactly the wrong direction. This is a particularly hazardous exercise as you're low, slow, maneuvering with bank applied and pitch up, gear and flap deployed, and typically have no guidance. What could go wrong? This is a recipe for spinning in, and your focus initially must be to gain speed and altitude, clean up when safe, and only when above the MDA, consider how you're going to turn towards the initial approach course. This is a classic example of where aviate, navigate, communicate is vital. Once you're pointing the right way, you can then execute the missed approach. Obviously, if the missed approach entails a turn back, like this one here, it makes sense simply to continue into that once above the MDA and still within the maneuvering area. I'm really sorry if there's a lot of background noise. My office is actually in a conservatory in the garden, and it's just started pouring with rain. So shout if it gets difficult to hear, and I'll move on to my earbud headphones, a microphone instead. So you should always have thoroughly briefed the missed approach, of course, but never more so than in a circling approach. Let's talk a little bit about automation. You've got the choice of using autopilot, flight director, or raw data, and each has its pros and cons. Most of our autopilots are restricted from use below 800 or 1,000 feet unless on a coupled approach, which doesn't include a circling approach. I can't actually think of a single GA autopilot which is permitted to be used any lower. Someone write in the chat if you can. And most circling approaches will be lower than that limit. So really, they're out of the equation. However, Flight Director is available. It has the advantage of giving you a single glance to check bank angle and altitude while you focus outside on visual references, so should help with disorientation. But Flight Director will require the settings made on the autopilot. So if you're going to use it, you need to both fly the autopilot and hand fly, which can be an increase in workload and be open to error. You have to ensure that the mode selection is correct. I would suggest using heading and alt modes until turning final, remembering to allow for double drift in the heading. But then what when you're turning final? Um, I would suggest that you can either use vertical speed and turn the heading bug, or you can set up the visual approach and use approach mode. To my mind, both these carry more disorientation risk than just using raw data. But what you absolutely mustn't do is leave the flight director on heading and alt as you turn and descend. That results in a disorientating instruction to turn away from final and climb. So once you've stopped using the flight director, you must disable it. Um, if you do need to go around, many autopilots have a toga button giving an immediate straight ahead and climb instruction, which is very valuable as you reorientate yourself and are cleaning up the airframe. Or, of course, you just use raw data and keep a very careful scan going of bank angle, heading, and altitude. If you have bugs, I strongly suggest using them. Obviously, this is going to detract from your focus outside the aircraft, which may be reduced to glances. So there's no correct answer. My choice would be flight director in heading and alt until you start the continuous aspect turn to final, then switch it off and look outside, just glancing inside for airspeed. Sorry to be going through this so fast, guys, but we've got very limited time and I do want plenty of time for discussion. Some circling approaches are limited to daytime use only, so make sure you check the plate for that. If you do make a circle to land at night, you should be aware that some runway edge lights are much less visible from the side than from final approach. So especially in poor visibility, you need to be very careful to keep them in sight. Visual cues are going to be considerably reduced, and of course, terrain won't be visible and obstacles only visible from their lights, which are notoriously difficult to judge distance at night. Personally, my aircraft avionics has a feature to provide 3D guidance for visual approaches to almost every runway, and I always set this up for the runway I'm going to land on, even if in a VFR visual circuit. And if workload permits, I would certainly do the same for a circle to land. Bear in mind that if you're using heading and altitude on the flight director, those modes won't be affected by having the HSI set up for the final approach. So you can load the visual approach for the landing runway as soon as you break off the instrument approach procedure. But if you do that and then go around into the missed approach, you'll need to reload the original approach in order to activate the missed approach procedure for the original initial approach instrument approach procedure. So that's a lot of button presses in a short period when flying low and slow, and can contribute to the difficulties and dangers of a circling approach. Was that someone trying to interrupt or just a background? Okay. Um, I also have Sky Demon running as it provides yet more orientation assistance, though it's yet another thing to look at and can mean your eyes are pulled away from the runway and the panel. So it depends again on workload. In summary, circling approaches carry risks and challenges. They have a high workload entailing quick decision making, precise control, and situational awareness. They carry a risk of spatial disorientation, especially if visibility varies or fluctuates. You may lose sight of the airport and immediately need to revert to instruments. And you mustn't hope that you're going to pop out again. You're either in the circling approach following its rules or you're not. And if you're not, you must go into the missed approach immediately. Again, Nathaniel, can we see if we can mute whoever's mic that is?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Thanks. The CFIT risk is high. Sorry, the control flight into terrain risk is high. So you must sit religiously to MDA, visibility, and speed rules. It's easy to go unstable. You must ensure that everything is planned and going to plan and be ready to throw it away. If you do go unstable in the final approach, you can consider making another visual circuit if the conditions permit, but then you must get a new ATC clearance and think about how to make the second approach better than the first. So, having established that circling approaches are difficult and hazardous, we should address the question of whether they can be avoided by landing on the straight-in runway for the approach. Uh, my home base used to have um, only an IAP in one direction. This is actually literally changing as we speak. It either changed in the last AIRAC cycle or the next one, but regardless, let's talk about this airport. It is one I know well. So when the wind's unfavourable, there's a circle to land to the reciprocal runway. I would say at least half of the aircraft given an ILS to 2-1 with a circle to land to 0-3 end up landing on 2-1, both for operational reasons, it's obviously quicker and cheaper than flying a circuit, but also because the pilots are choosing the risk of a tailwind landing over the risks of a circle to land. So before you start the procedure, you need to know whether a tailwind landing is in limits for your aircraft, its landing weights and runway length, which may entail going into graphs, so it should be done well before you get there. Even if you decide that a tailwind landing is in limits, you may opt to do the circle to land, but then if you reach the circling MDA and can't see the runway environment, you also know whether it's acceptable to continue to take the tailwind and continue to the decision approach for the approach, sorry, the decision altitude for the approach, or whether to go round from the circling MDA. On the other hand, if the cloud base and visibility is not an issue, there's nothing to say that you need to descend to the circling minima before you start the circle to land. Indeed, you may well simply descend to circuit altitude and perform a normal VFR circuit if you're happy there's no chance of re-entering IMC. Right. So that's all I have to say about circling approaches. I'm now going to look at visual circuits with prescribed tracks or VPTs. So while with the circling approaches, tracks are at your discretion, providing you stay within the protected area, in a VPT, you must follow a specific predefined ground track. They're mostly used to ensure terrain and obstacle clearance and for noise abatement compliance. In Europe, they're only common in France and to a lesser extent in Spain. And the one that most of us are most likely to encounter is in Cannes, where the IFR approaches are northerly, even for the southerly landing. But there are half a dozen others outside France, other airfields in Europe I can think of, which describe their approaches as VPT, A Coruña, Pamplona in Spain, Bolzano in Italy, Lugano in Switzerland, though there are plenty, such as Madeira and Sion, or Sion, where it's described as a visual approach, but actually there are prescribed tracks, and so therefore it's effectively a VPT. A visual circuit normally allows some flexibility to fly within a general pattern around the airfield, but in a prescribed procedure, the aircraft must follow a strictly defined route, often with specific turn points, altitude restrictions, and even possibly speed constraints. However, unless it's specified otherwise in the procedure, you're only required to maintain sufficient visual reference to follow the prescribed track. You don't need to be visual with the runway until you need to start to descend below the MDA. So from that point of view, it's very different from a circling approach. So long as you can see enough to follow the tracks, you don't need to be able to see the runway. They're mainly used for noise abatement, but also to ensure aircraft remain clear of terrain and obstacles, and they're widely used in mountainous areas for that reason, and also to provide spacing from other airport traffic or nearby controlled airspace. Um, as I said, the exact route must be followed, either depicted by specific waypoints or visual landmarks, and that route is sometimes monitored for compliance. I'm not the only person here to have received a route letter from Cannes, I'm sure. There are usually altitude restrictions as well, possibly including step downs for noise, safety, and separation reasons, and these will probably be monitored for adherence as well. Turns are normally prescribed at exact locations, but sometimes turns are prohibited until passing a designated point, like beyond a river or something. Some VPTs and visual procedures have quite low speed limits to manage spacing and prevent unstable approaches. There may be a holding point, such as a specific waypoint of visual reference, where the aircraft must orbit until cleared. The main thing to say about VPTs is they require careful briefing. I know so many pilots who've been cleared for the localizer approach at 17 at Cannes, and even when established on the FAT of 346, have still not twigged and emitted a loud expletive as they lose all situational awareness at minima. Um, Luckily, Luxus and Pbon are in the databases and in SkyDemon. But if you arrive at minima without even knowing the VPT exists, and plenty of people have done that, you're pretty much stuffed. So you really need to brief and have situational awareness. Part of that briefing is that for VPT procedures, there's usually a missed approach, but the missed approach procedure may not take into account deterioration to IMC. So if the weather's marginal, you need the situational awareness to know how to deal with the loss of visual reference. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say about VPTs. Now on to offset approaches. And it's important to understand the difference between an offset approach and a circling approach. An offset approach is designated to the landing runway. So, for example, you might have a runway QDM of 247 designated 25, but the localizer orientated on, say, 273. I mean, this is an example from Le Bourget, meaning a left turn of 26 degrees at decision altitude. But it's still designated for runway 25. An offset instrument approach is one when the final approach course is offset by more than 3 degrees, but not more than 30 degrees from the extended runway centerline. If the offset exceeds 30 degrees, the approach is considered a circling approach. Having said that, it's still a circling approach even if the difference is less than 30 degrees if the instrument procedure isn't designated for the landing runway. Indeed, in Europe, where there's no sidestep maneuvers, this is obviously from an American plate, but where sidestep maneuvers are not defined, you can have a circling approach to a parallel runway where ILS and both runways all have the same orientation, but the sidestep from one to the other is still considered to be a circling approach. Um, Offset approaches are usually used where terrain, airspace restrictions, or obstacles lie in the direct path of the runway or provide insufficient lateral clearance. Normally, the expectation is that you'll make a straight-in landing. Because you need to maneuver before landing, minima are higher than for normal straight-in landings. Generally speaking, the procedure will cross the extended center line at minima, meaning you get the best view of the approach lights and runway environment from minima. And that means that unlike a normal approach, if you were to continue straight once below minima, you'll be pointing to one side of the runway, and for that reason, the missed approach point is generally set at a point where the slope intercepts the MDA, so maybe a mile or a mile and a half before the threshold. When you reach minima, you need to decide whether you have adequate maneuvering room and visibility to realign and land safety. Obviously, if in doubt, go around. Of course, you always brief the missed approach, but it's especially important on an offset approach as the go around is more likely because a combination of higher minima, less familiar visual environment, and the need to go around if the visual maneuvering doesn't work out. Okay, I think that's enough about that. So let's just talk very briefly about low level and bad weather circuits, which, unlike the circling approach, are VFR procedures. There's a slight difference between low level and bad weather circuits, though to my mind at least, and Anthony may be able to tell me about this because I don't know the difference. The difference is fairly marginal between the two, in that a bad weather circuit is what you do for real because of ceiling visibility or icing, making a standard circuit impossible, whereas a low-level circuit is what you do in training to prepare yourself for that eventuality and for skill improvement. And the military use them for operational reasons like not being shot down and stuff. So these circuits are flown at a lower height than normal visual circuits, either to remain below cloud cover or within visual range of the runway and poor visibility, while maintaining safety margins from terrain and obstacles. They're essential for continuing safe flight operations in deteriorating weather conditions at airfields without instrument landing facilities. Generally, they're flown between 5 and 800 feet above ground level, only going lower in an emergency where no other options remain. A low-level circuit is flown using the same visual cues as a normal circuit, meaning the circuit will be tighter and closer into the runway. That means everything happens faster with reduced reaction time. You must anticipate turns earlier due to lower altitude and reduced visibility. And the risk of hitting obstacles is increased. You must be aware of trees, buildings, masts, power lines, and so on. Very often, the circuit will not have the same crosswind, downwind, and base legs of the conventional circuit, but we've flown more as an oval, allowing you to keep a better eye on the runway and maintaining a constant aspect, and also allowing for micro adjustment in the turn. This also means that an earlier turn from downwind through base to final will be executed to ensure that the final approach is stable with a normal perspective. Joining the circuit can be a challenge. Obviously, an overhead join is not possible, and I would advocate joining downwind at circuit height in order to get orientated before the base turn onto final. If a 45-degree downwind join is mandated, like in Germany and some other European countries, you need to keep your eyes out to ensure that you turn onto downwind far enough before the runway. This can be a real challenge in poor visibility, as the turn onto downwind will take you closer in. From a 45 degrees angle, it's manageable, about 250 meters closer in. But from a 90-degree cut, using a rate one turn, which is the maximum I'd suggest given your low height and the dangers of disorientation and spinning, it's close to half a mile. I would suggest being fully configured for landing before you join downwind, at least as far as sensible and permitted in your aircraft type. It saves configuration changes and the loss of stability and disorientation that they can cause in poor visibility and at low level. Different countries have different procedures and regulations. In the UK and France, they're generally at the pilot's discretion outside control space, though some altiports in France have prescribed special low-level circuits. In other countries, such as Germany, VFR minima are more strictly enforced. The risk of low-level circuits, especially in poor visibility or beneath a low and variable ceiling, are considerable. It's easy to get lost and be unable to see the runway, to get disorientated and lose track of bank angle and airspeed, potentially resulting in irrecoverable stalls and spins, to misjudge final approach angle and speed because of reduced distance and reaction time, to find yourself in cloud and tempted to go down to recover surface contact, to uh, to mid-air collision with other aircraft caught out with weather trying to get by the weather trying to get home. The risks are further compounded by turbulence and wind shear associated with the weather conditions which create the necessity for doing these things. For all these reasons, you must be careful to brief what to expect: elevation, terrain, obstacles, speed, and bank angles, and most particularly, what conditions or circumstances will result in a go-around, change to IFR, and/or a diversion. This may be particularly challenging if you're not qualified to fly an IMC or the aircraft's not equipped. Of course, that's ironic because you're only likely to be doing this if IFR options are limited. So, all these risks, all these procedures are risk bearing. The circle to land is the riskiest IFR normal procedure, and the bad weather circuit flown in minimal conditions is risky. So all I can ask and suggest is you can avoid them, is that you avoid them whenever you can, and you're very, very careful when you do have to do them to minimum. Okay, that's all I've got to say. I've got to find a way of stopping sharing now. How do I do that? Stop share. Right, there we go.
I've done it for
Hi.
you.
All right, excellent. So, right. So, Nathaniel, what have people said
Uh,
in the
there's not one message or one
not
question.
one
I've made
message?
contact.
Okay, well. 7:05. Good night, everyone. No, no, seriously. I'm happy just to open the floor.
Yeah.
The only question I would ask of any ab initio instructors, Anthony maybe, um, is there a difference between a bad weather circuit and a low level circuit, or are they essentially the same thing?
I was going to ask you that question, Timothy.
Oh,
I
right,
I,
okay.
I think um, there's so many variations of a bad weather circuit, but bad weather circuit could be a low level circuit, couldn't it?
Okay,
But it
so
could, but
uh,
it could
uh,
could be something else. And as you said, it's VFR, whereas the circling approach is IFR. I would think the average IMC pilot in the UK is totally confused and doesn't practice it very often. Some examiners don't even ask for it because I've come across
no,
that quite a bit.
no,
So
but no, my only question was whether they are two different things or the same thing, and I think you're saying they're essentially the same thing.
I think so, yeah.
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 Just while I'm talking, um, you're stressing this evening the importance of circling approaches. It's just something the CA does not require in the initial IR test or in the IR revalidations renewals. Are there any, I'm not that familiar with the FA. Are there any authorities with your knowledge that actually put any emphasis at all on a circling approach on an IR test or
Uh,
check?
not to my knowledge, but look, we've got a room full of tens of people. Does anyone
So
know?
why don't we ever practice it if it's important?
No, I totally agree. I
Yeah.
totally agree. So is there
I did a
anyone
type rating in the US and it absolutely was part of it.
In a type rating, yeah, okay.
It was a type rating, it was a core part of it. You had to do a type rating, you had to do a circling approach, and then something happened. I can't remember as well, but it definitely was part of the requirement.
and was it a type rating that incorporated an IR?
No, no, you had to already have an IR to do
No,
Oh,
it.
yeah, but most type ratings in Europe, and I don't know about America, the type rating is also an IR on the type because the uh,
yeah.
most of us only have a an MEP or SEP class rating IR, and if you go onto a jet or whatever that needs a type rating, then the IR is part of that.
That's a very good question.
Okay, well, no
It
matter.
shows I went whoosh over my head. It was 2 weeks of stuff where all you could guarantee was lots of stuff would break every time you went flying because it was in a sim. But I
So
was
it,
definitely certainly glad.
so it may
Adam's
not
got
be
his
with
hand up.
it's
Sorry.
probably not within the standard IR instrument check in the States.
Adam has his hand up. Are you
I was
answering
just saying,
something
when
on
I
this
did
point?
my instrument rating in the States earlier this year, it was very much part of the training and included in the test.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yet another way in which the Americans do instrument training and testing better than we do, but let's not get into that one.
No
Is
comment.
it? Well, I think those of us
Yeah,
involved in
yeah.
instrument rating, training, and testing all over Europe have a fairly low opinion of how it's done. Okay, any other questions or observations?
I'll just say so one thing. I've only very early on in my flying career nearly came a cropper, and that was in Albenga in Italy. And there's, when ATC says, "Are you sure?" You really should listen. And then there was a tailwind, and I said, oh, "I'll do a circle," and they said, "Are you sure? It's a long runway." But I thought I was being very sensible. And as I did my circle into a valley, I realized this was not the smartest. But anyway, the point is, yeah, I totally go with your think carefully before picking a circle over the alternative.
Yeah, and I mean, just as an aside, have you ever done it at Gstaad?
No.
That that is quite a circle. And anyone on here who's done that will know what I. In fact, I've got a recording on YouTube of doing it in the Cheyenne. It's quite exciting. Okay, anyone else? Any tips for Edmund is saying any tips for autopilot and VPT? As my basic understanding of them, while the waypoints are in the database, they're not loaded as part of the procedure. I mean, there aren't that many VPTs, Edmund. I think the one that most of us do most of the time is CAN, and I am fairly sure that no, the PBON and whatever the other one is called are not in the JEP database, but they are definitely in SkyDeem, and I imagine they're in the other of iPad apps. But no, I agree. Wouldn't it be great if you could just sequence into them? But I don't believe you can. Anything else? There's also the question of whether you can use the autopilot at the altitude, or sorry, at the height of the procedure it can. I can't remember how low it is. I think it may be above most people's autopilot limits. Oh, I did ask the question, can anyone think of a GA autopilot that you can use below 1,000 or 800 feet? No? Okay. So I think I was probably right about that.
Well, you
Okay.
can take, you mean you're allowed to, the manual says, or that will function properly?
Oh gosh, come on, it will
Because at
function
600, yeah.
properly. It will function properly going along the runway at 10 feet. You'll just be mad to do it.
Yeah, so there's some sequencing stuff. I have a Cirrus, and actually, there are on takeoff. There are certain things that won't kick in until certain altitudes. But so even if you set it like flight level control or whatever, it won't sequence. Um, Cirrus is saying at 600 feet, it will is when their manual says.
Well, what I know from the sim, and it may or may not be accurate, and I'm never going to try it in real life, is that you can fly an LPV approach on the autopilot all the way down to the ground, and actually it won't hit the ground. It will raise the nose and fly along the runway. That's what happens in the sim. And of course, the sim is a lot of the electronics or a lot of the software has come directly out of from Garmin. So my guess is, at least I've only tried it on the GTN, not on the GNS. My guess is that if you applied a bit of power, that's exactly what it would do. But I'm never going to try.
Who's volunteering?
Are there any other questions? Come on, guys, speak up. Tell me I'm wrong, Tom.
Yeah, the GFC 500 can be used on the approach until 200 feet.
Yeah, that's a coupled approach.
Yes, yes.
I'm talking. I mean, that's exactly my point. In a circle to land, of course, you're not coupled, and
Correct.
my expectation is that the GFC 500, 600 series will have either an 800 foot or 1,000 foot
It's 800.
limitation. 800, yeah. In the book, I mean, though, yeah. As we've been saying, it will work lower, but it's not clever or funny, shall we say?
When you're doing the jet in Cirrus, they basically have you're an autopilot. You're not hand flying. I'll try that in English. You're not meant to hand fly the circle to land approach. You actually what they teach is to use the autopilot.
That's very interesting, even at 500 feet.
Correct. I mean, it's a year and a half ago, and I did it. But you were using the autopilot when you doing a circle using the heading bug.
That is interesting. Do you know what autopilot it's got?
Well, it's a 3000 Garmin 3000.
So is that the GFC 600 that's incorporated into that?
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Don't know. It's Garmin 3000 avionics. But you're right about the avionics. I don't know. I can Google it, but you're using.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we've just heard, and I sort of knew this to be true, that the GFC is limited to 800 feet unless coupled. So I wonder where Cirrus is getting the confidence, shall we say, to fly a visual approach, sorry, a circling approach below that height on, I don't know. I know nothing. Has anyone else got any information? There's a lot of silence out there. Come on, guys. We're a membership organization. We're all in this together, and about 5 of us have opened our mouths. Anyone else? any other comments about the presentation I did? Any other questions?
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Thank you, Timothy. That was a fabulous presentation. It's not exactly a question, but I just wanted to share an interesting experience I had doing a circling approach and just invite comments, feedback, suggestions for how it might have been done differently. It was a few years ago going into Roskilde, which is Copenhagen, and they have a pair of runways which are more or less at right angles. The cloud base was nominally something around 300 or 400 feet, but the weather was quite sort of variable. And I was being vectored onto an ILS for runway 21, so more or less in the southerly direction. And there's a very strong westerly wind, maybe 20 knots, and it had been snowing. So this would involve landing on a runway with fresh snow and a strong crosswind. So I was quite motivated to be able to circle to land onto 29 and land into wind. But there's no, I think there may be an instrument approach, but it's an RNAV or something with much higher decision height. So the cloud base was such that I was very confident of getting in on the ILS onto the crosswind runway, and it was very marginal as to whether I would have visual reference at the circling minimum. And since I didn't know how it was going to work out, I ended up requesting, I was given clearance to land. I ended up requesting landing clearance for both runways, which I was then given. And then I did have visual reference at circling minimum that it's a very straightforward circle to land into wind. So it worked out quite nicely. But it was just curious because in 35 years of flying, it's the only time I've requested landing clearance on two different runways at the same time. It just seemed rather curious, but with hindsight, it felt like that was probably the right thing to do. I don't know.
I'm sure it was the right thing to do, but it's a shit decision to have to take, isn't it? I wonder if there's anyone else on this call who has actually gone sideways down a runway in a Cessna 404, having done it and landed on a snow and ice covered runway in a strong crosswind. And yeah, the whole thing went round sideways. I used outside engine because there was no point trying to use brakes. I used outside engine and put it. Luckily, I was empty. It was a positioning flight, but that was really scary. So yeah, I think landing in a strong crosswind on ice is risky, and I think doing a circle to land with a low cloud base is risky. And I suppose the third possibility would have been for you to have gone somewhere else which had an ILS into I mean, it's very preachy to say that, of course it is. But it should be something that there's a press on itis is dangerous. And you might want to think back over that episode and think, meh, could you have gone to somewhere else with an in-to-win runway? But that I know that sounds very preachy.
To be clear, there's no suggestion there was ice on the runway. It was fresh snow. It had just started to snow. So it was, but nevertheless,
Well,
the combination is not ideal.
Yeah, come on. I think everything we've just said applies just as much to snow as ice, but yes.
I think we've got a couple of questions in the chat. One from Aberleave, Rich, and Simon.
I certainly don't know the answer. I'll read out Rich's question to those of you who aren't looking at it. Does anyone know why some approaches, such as the ILS at Oxford, say that ILS is not to be used for auto-coupled approaches? I don't know the answer to that. Anthony, do you know?
No.
You sometimes see a note on that an approach is not suitable for auto-coupled approaches. And it seems to be related to the quality or stability of the ILS signal.
Okay. I mean, I would have thought that the glide slope signal is either good enough to do an ILS approach or it isn't. Personally, but hey, what do I know?
I don't know. I've seen not very often, but I've seen these notes a few times.
Okay.
I was flying. Sorry, I was just going to say I was flying. I was flying yesterday, and I overheard someone being told that the ILS may fluctuate because an A380 would turn across the ILS signal, because obviously the A380 is huge. So when the A380 had landed and it was going to taxi off, it was going to turn across the ILS signal. So I think where that happens, you wouldn't want it necessarily coupled to the autopilot if there's a risk of that at some airports.
Yeah, and there's a lot of 380s at Oxford Airport. Sorry, for those of us who don't know Oxford, Oxford is a pretty small airport. I mean, it's yeah, landing in a 125 was interesting.
It's also Timothy. It's also London, Oxford, and nowhere near London.
There is that as well.
Like London,
And
South End, London everywhere, yeah.
Yeah. And Cambridge is always better. Okay. Simon says, it seems to me there's a catch-22 in the topic of risk management and circling approaches. Would one preemptively plan to land at a destination that's likely to require circling? If not, then the scenario that requires use of circling unexpectedly is particularly risky if it requires mid-air rebrief to circle. I'd divert. What do you think? I mean, I think, Simon, I don't know if anyone else wants to pick this up, but I think that's absolutely right. You really should. I mean, and it's not just for circling. Whenever you're making an approach, I mean, let's just say you're making a perfectly ordinary ILS approach, and it's hovering around minima. And some reports are saying 150 feet, some are saying 200 feet. There is some sense in saying, do you know what? I'm not even going to give it a go. I'm just going to go somewhere else and come back later or whatever. So I think there's always the question of considering not, depending on obviously your equipment and your personal skill level and so on. But in any approach, I think that's true. But I do agree with Simon, it's particularly true of a circling approach because there's so much more to go wrong. And Richard has just said in the notes that the Oxford jet plate says pilots may experience glide path fluctuations within 1 DME. And if, as I believe, the DME is on the airfield, then at 1 DME, you're going to be at approximately 300 feet. So that would seem to be a little bit late to have the autopilot coupled anyway, but there you go.
That's also a very good point because the minima is 305 feet above the airfield. So you're right about that.
Well, one DME, if it's at the threshold, if it's zeroed at the threshold, one DME is actually 318 feet. There am I a nerd. So if it's 305 feet, so that's 13 feet in which you're taking a risk.
But it could be something as silly as that for scriptures. It is an ILS DME and it is reasonably low minima, but I haven't seen it on a plate before, and it is on the plate saying ILS not to be used. You're correct for auto-coupled approaches. So I've got to look through all the notes and see why.
But Tim is saying that he thinks it's because of the ILS antenna positioning being obscured. But I mean, are we talking there about localizer or glide slope? I don't know, because the thing that Richard has put up is about the way it says glide path fluctuations, so glide slope fluctuations. Just a matter of interest, does everyone know the difference between a glide path and a glide slope? Well, I won't wait for the answer. But it's quite an interesting one. The glide slope is the electronic signal that comes out of an ILS, whereas the glide path is what you fly. So technically, the thing that Richard has, I suppose it is still true, glide path fluctuations, but really the glide path is what you do through the sky, and the glide slope is simply the bit of electronics that provides you the guidance to do that. That's something I learned relatively late in my career, so I thought I'd just pass that on.
And the DME is 0 at the threshold, according to the plate. So your 300 feet thing is,
yeah. Well, I don't know. Right. And oh, by the way, we did suggest right at the beginning, possibly before some people joined, that if anyone just wants to, I don't mind how long we continue, but if anyone just wants to wander away because they've had enough, don't be embarrassed. Just quietly tiptoe out of the room if we go on too long. Anything else? Any other questions or observations?
Hi everyone, Eleonora here. I had a question. What would the airliners or military do? Would they divert or circle?
My experience of flying professionally, and again, I'm sure there are many other professional pilots here, is that you fly to minima, and it becomes a very binary decision of if the weather says it's above minima for the procedure you want to do, then you fly it. And if you don't fly it, you could have words from your management later on. But if you do fly it when it's below minima, you'll have stronger words. So that's my experience of professional flying, that there's much less discretion than we have. But if there are any other professional pilots on board who want to say anything different. No, well, I guess people are agreeing. Chris says, isn't GS ILS, glide slope ILS, and glide path GPS? No, it's not. I mean, you have a glide path on the CDFA approach on, I don't know, a VOR approach. The glide path is what you fly through the sky, and glide slope is how that's electronically provided by the ILS. Holger, how would you make a low-vis approach to a VFR field if you are IFR en route? Well, yeah, I mean, a 1,000 different answers to that question, and it's in some ways, if I'm answering the question, it's a case of do what I say, don't do what I do, because what I would do, frankly, is to make use of the GTN visual approach facility and decide in advance how low I was prepared to take that. That's what I would do. But I'm sure there are many people, probably Anthony among them, who would say, if you can't meet the VFR minima and make a cloud break knowing where you are, then you shouldn't be doing it. Is that something you want to come in on, Anthony?
No further comment. No.
So what would you personally do?
Just do
say you're approaching a VFR airfield, which, for the sake of argument, has got a 700-foot cloud base, and you are IFR en route. What would you do?
This airfield's got an instrument approach?
No, VFR airfield.
It's a difficult question. Lot of aircraft we fly now, you can load a visual approach, can't you?
Well, that's what I was just saying. But
I think yes. Sorry if I'm a bit dozy on that one. I think I hope to be able to load that. Otherwise, you're a bit in no man's land, aren't you?
Well, I mean, I totally agree. I would use the visual approach. I think there are many people who would say that what you should do is shoot an ILS somewhere nearby and fly across at 650 feet. I think that is a very, very bad idea.
That's probably the official answer, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say that is what the CAA in the UK anyway say. I don't know about other other authorities. I personally think that's a very stupid thing to do, and it makes much more sense to fly the visual approach into the airfield if you've got one, or even if you're careful, really careful, an OBS approach using a 2D GPS box, and that's perfectly doable as well. But I would suggest that if you're going to do that, you definitely plan it in advance. I actually have, sorry.
I was just going to add, I've had one case in Yorkshire a couple of years ago when I could actually see enough to get in below the cloud, stay legal VFR under the cloud, and avoid having to make a cloud break down to whatever the defined minima were in IMC. So occasionally, if you can see enough of the situation, you may find that you can get in underneath. I've also tried to do that in Leicester once, and I couldn't do it, and I had to divert. But sometimes, if you can see enough of where the cloud is, there's space to get in underneath VFR, going VFR slightly earlier, maybe 5 miles earlier.
Okay, I agree. I'm just going to try and find a. I've actually made an Excel spreadsheet, which works out how to do an OBS approach. But no, sadly, I can't find it right at this minute. If anyone's interested, I'm very happy to either post it on the forum or whatever. But essentially, it calculates a rate of descent and check altitudes for any particular elevation, runway length, and so on. Because of course, the runway length, if you do a straight-in approach to the airfield, then the airfield reference point is halfway down the runway. So therefore, the longer the runway, if you want to still aim for the threshold, the higher you have to be. Was it lower? I don't. Anyway,
No.
I can't think on my feet, but unfortunately, I can't immediately see it in my documents. But yeah, Holger's asked me to put that up there, so I will try and find it and do exactly that thing, providing I haven't lost it. Right. Various people are disappearing. That's fine. Yes, and Per is saying quite rightly that the airfield reference point is not necessarily on the main. It normally is in the middle of the main runway. But if you take, for example, Prestwick, if you're landing on the short runway at Prestwick, the ARP is wildly away from that runway because the two runways meet at their ends rather than in the middle. So yeah, that is always also something to be aware of.
I mean,
I
Timothy,
looked it up recently, and it said that the AS rules, that he said that the reference point should be in the middle of the airport area, and it should not be moved even if the airport is changed or extended or whatever. So it
Right,
could
yeah.
be.
So there's another gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all these things need planning in advance, need thinking about in advance.
I mean,
And sorry.
I weekly commute to Elstree, and I know there's no high buildings in the way. I come in IFR and then get dropped out of controlled airspace. So I think it's one of those things of, with modern Garmin avionics, the visual approach, it's very good. And I happen to know it's very, for Elstree, it would work. But I'm not entirely certain, I think it's one of those don't have an accident or an incident because you'd have trouble explaining away your choices.
I agree. And of course, it's very ironic that you use that particular example because one of the VRPs on final for Elstree is actually called Tall Building.
Yeah, but it's not directly aligned. But you're absolutely right. It's yeah. I mean, your biggest issue with Elstree, well, as well as that, is the noise abatement. If you
Oh, and
don't
the shit
follow the weird
runways.
one for, sorry, oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of tarmac, kind of.
Except where it isn't. Okay, anyone else who wants to say anything on topic? Oh, one new. What's that? That's a nice thing for Andrew to say, but isn't really a question. So shall we call it a day?
Well, if I could just add a comment about the risk of circling. I trained instrument flying at Roskilde, that was also mentioned earlier, and we do a lot of circling because there's not a usable approach for runway 29 and we have westerly winds. So I did a lot of circling and I really consider them a normal operation. And landing with a tailwind is not just about runway length. Of course, that is important, but it's also about the speed that you get to the ground with. You should be sure that you can actually handle the aircraft on the ground at that speed with a tailwind, even though if it's technically possible to stop before the end.
Yeah, but most POHs will have a maximum tailwind component for exactly that reason.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
if you're
something
with,
to consider, I would
sure,
say.
sure. And for anyone who hasn't done tailwind landings, I mean, I've been flying for many thousands of hours and many decades, and every time I do a tailwheel landing, I'm still surprised by how difficult it is and how far down the runway you go. It's much more of a thing than you would think if you haven't tried it. And I don't know if other people agree with that, but you find yourself in the flare over the piano keys, and you're just thinking, it's got to go down, it's got to go down, it's got to, and it just doesn't. But yeah, so do be careful. I completely agree with Per. Do be concerned about tailwind landings. Right, shall we call it a day?
Timothy,
Yes.
can I just ask you one totally unrelated to this? There's the end of October, there was a new UK UK Part NCO, yes, and I'm told that there's no more single pilot minimum. You can just fly down to Category 1 minimum. The 800 meters restriction on single pilots, single crew has gone, but I can't actually find the wording. I'm told that because it doesn't say anything about the 800 meters, it's gone. Is that the basis that it's no longer there?
No, I would turn it round. The 800 meters was never a rule. It was always a recommendation.
Right.
We've always been permitted to go down to 550 meters if we wanted to.
Because it was an AMC.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the person who will know all about this will be Julian. He's the world expert on these things.
But we are taking it now that there's no, depending on your skill and all the rest of it, there's no restriction to the 800 meters if it says 750 on the plate.
But if it says 750 on the plate, then it's 750.
Or 550.
I mean, 550 is more common, but yes.
Yes.
That's my understanding. But I think maybe we should have a little discussion on the forum with Julian involved, because he always understands. Sorry.
Can I just add that in the EASA, I think it's in the AMC, the limit in Part NCO is 550.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No matter what it says on the plate and what your minimums are.
Yeah. I believe that has always been the case.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think if the plate says 750 or 700, that will be based on usually based on a higher decision height, or possibly poor lighting. So I think that is limiting.
No, sorry, I've confused the issue. All I was saying was that if the plate says below 800 meters and a Category 1's going to minimum 550 meters, we can now use that.
And I would come back and say we always have been able to.
Yes, okay.
It was just a recommendation to go to 800.
Okay, fair point. Yep. Okay.
Okay, guys, it's probably time to disappear. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
There's another webinar on Thursday, apparently.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
bye.
Thanks
Thanks
very
Very
much.
much, everyone. Have a good night. See you at the next
Thank you.
webinars.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.